start at 11:30, and that's why I would like to encourage you to join us. The session that we will begin at 11:30 is a special event at FAO pavilions, lessons from different mitigation areas, case studies on research, and tools to quantify mitigation emissions and also mitigation strategies in dairy sectors. It's a combination, it's a joint effort between Global Dairy Platform and also CGIAR and FAO. And that's why I would like to welcome all of you, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Thanawat Tiansin, uh, the new directors of Animal Production and Health Divisions of the Food and Agriculture Organizations. Before, I was the permanent representative of Thailand to UN agencies in Rome, and also the chairpersons of the UN Committee on World Food Securities. Please allow me to welcome all of you to the Global Dairy Platforms and CGIAR and FAO co-organizing these side events. As you know, that livestock play a major role in improving nutrition, food securities of farmers and livelihoods. And also these sessions is a joint effort between CGIAR that we will discuss about the science and also research for emissions quantifications. And also the second session we will focus on dairy. And that's why during my first 60 days in the office, actually today is 70 days already in the office at FAO, and that's why it's good opportunities to share with you that when I took the office as the new FAO directors for animal production and health, we are focused on sustainable livestock transformations. And that's why during last 2 weeks, FAO organized the FAO Science and Innovation Forums, and also CGIAR is our key partners because we want to bring science and innovations for agri-food system transformation. And also we want to use science and innovation for sustainable livestock transformation as well. And that's why we need to work together to make sure that we bring all the global policies translate into actions, and to make sure that all actions can bring benefit to our farmers, and also to make sure that bring benefit to our climate actions. And today I would like to invite Mr. Donna Moore, Executive Directors of the Global Dairy Platform, to join us during the welcome sessions. And also we have Mr. Juan Lucas from CGIAR Alliance of Biodiversity International. Donald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thanawat, and thank you also to CGIAR and FAO for co-hosting this side event with us. Within the dairy sector, we have been addressing the question of sustainability from dairy for over 10 years now. We've been tracking and reporting on dairy sustainability through the Dairy Sustainability Framework for 10 years. And in that time period, we've noticed that the single highest prioritized item for dairy across the entire value chain has been greenhouse gas emissions, followed by biodiversity and animal care. But that challenge around greenhouse gas emissions in the dairy sector led us in 2019 to do a study with FAO to understand the emission profile of dairy from all the regions in the world. We now know that dairy in a 10-year period reduced its emission intensity by around 11%, but because of growth in the dairy sector in that time period, the absolute emissions of dairy continued to increase. So as a sector, last year we launched an initiative called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which is a global initiative on behalf of the dairy sector to tackle the underlying issues of greenhouse gas emissions in dairy, not just methane, but also nitrous oxide and also carbon dioxide. But in order for us to have a program such as Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, it is incredibly important that we have the underlying tools in place to allow us to measure our life cycle analysis, but also to measure improvements that we're making along the way. And so my colleagues who are going to speak to you this morning will be covering some of the tools that underpin our Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative. On Friday, we have an official side event where we will be reporting the progress of Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. That's at 11:30 to 1 in the Teebs room. And then later in the day at 4:30 p.m., we'll be back here in the FAO pavilion to share some more of the detail about Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce a co-moderator to the stage, Juan Lucas Restrepo, the Director General of CGIAR. So Juan Lucas, the stage is yours.
Good morning to all. I'm a bit tall for this microphone and I may risk you not hearing me, so I prefer to just use this one. It's great to be here in the Food and Agriculture Pavilion. This is a very positive signal of FAO, CGIAR and Rockefeller working much closer together. We need to see more of that in the future, given this huge climate and hunger challenge we need to face and address together. On mitigation and the dairy sector, I would like to start from personal experience. I am from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. CIAT is based in Colombia, and I visited a couple of livestock producers and dairy producers that are, I think that experience is critical to be conveyed in this meeting. The first one is a big farm on the savannas of the Orinoco Basin. It's about 5,000 hectares that have developed a very intensive production system for beef production, where we've been monitoring and measuring that system for a while, and we are able, with very good science, with very proper measurements that are available for scrutiny, to determine that the way that farm is run is producing carbon positive meat. And this is to say that there are more and less sustainable production systems in livestock, and that we really need to address and embrace that heterogeneity, celebrate the more sustainable, and see how we cope and we help with the transition of the less sustainable ones. And this works as well for smallholders, mixed production, dairy and meat in silvopastoral systems that are also intensive in knowledge, intensive in production, and produce great environmental positive externalities. And the last experience is also that and this is something we identified, is that one of the forages we have managed for and conserved for decades in our gene bank, it's a Brachiaria humidicola, is able to support inhibition of, it inhibits nitrification. And this, of course, limits the nitrous oxide gas that's very harmful, and it does it in a very significant manner. The second element is that, of course, related to the Paris Agreement, this very important agreement on measuring emissions is critical, and we're going to talk about that. And for livestock, of course, it's very important, and even more so when we talk about tropical livestock, tropical production. So we will hear a bit about that. And my last message is that mitigation, of course, that's the core of the business, but adaptation is as critical. We need to ensure food security, and we need to ensure livelihoods. And in order to do so, I'm very happy to see commitments going towards that, but understanding that the run for mitigation cannot be stopped as adaptation has limits, and the species and the biology and soils have limits, and if we reach too high levels of temperature, those adaptation mechanisms, or a lot of those adaptation mechanisms, will start failing, and we would not have accomplished anything. Having said that, let me pass it to the first two panelists, and let's start with Dr. Lou Verchot. Lou is a lead scientist of the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. He's also the leader of an important CGIAR initiative called Mitigate Plus. He has a great experience on restoration, mitigation, and I'm pretty sure he's going to also talk a bit about low emission development. So let's start with Lou, and then after he's done, we ask Suren to also come to the stage. So Lou, over to you.
Can I have my presentation, please? Hello? My clock starts when this comes up, right? We have a very tightly timed presentation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a case study of integrating scientific data into tropical ecosystems into IPCC National Greenhouse Gas Accounting Guidelines. And I want to talk to you about the work that we did in the wetland supplement on peatlands. This is a global map of where peatlands exist in the world. And so you can see we have large expanses of peatlands in South America, Central America, throughout Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific area, and of course in Africa, very large areas. Just for scale, this peatland right here is about the size of the UK. Okay, so very large areas of peatland. The data that was available to us comes from here. So the emissions factor for drained organic soils or drained peatlands are all based upon data from Southeast Asia. So, and a tier 1 emissions factor used any place in the world will be based solely on these data. So, and this is because of the representativeness of the data that exists in the scientific literature. We often have scientific limitations, limitations of scope of where measurements have been made in generating these emissions factors. There's two approaches that are used in the literature to assess emissions from peatlands. There's a mass balance approach where scientists look typically at inputs to peatlands through litter fall and root mortality, and then they measure the outputs through dissolved organic carbon that's leaving through the drainage canals and what's going out as heterotrophic respiration. We typically measure soil respiration, and that integrates both root respiration and respiration associated with microbial decomposition of organic matter. And we need to separate those. And many studies do not. I've seen many studies in the literature that attributed total soil respiration to an emission, and that's not actually the case. So we have to separate these things out as we're going through this as scientists trying to generate emissions factors, because typically not all studies in the literature are done with the expectation or the objective of trying to generate an emissions factor. So we need to find ways to make some of the separations and adapt the literature that exists to the types of calculations that we need to be able to do. So we do have some indications of the separation between heterotrophic and autotrophic respiration. We use those factors to then apply them to studies that have not made that separation to make the best estimate for the sites that we're including in the work. There's also a method based upon subsidence, because peatlands typically form, particularly ambrotrophic peatlands that get all of their water from rainfall and not from groundwater. They are formed in domes, and as they get drained, they lose buoyancy and they collapse. And there are a number of studies that relate the collapse to emissions. But as you can see down here in these lower graphs, there is a temporal aspect to subsidence, and the rate of subsidence declines with time. And not all of the studies that we have actually measure through the full time range. Many studies are on very young peatlands. You know, if a peatland's only been drained for the first 10 years, we still don't know how it's settled down for the 20 and 30 year time frame. There's also a significant change in the percentage of subsidence that's attributable to oxidation. And peat oxidation is the emission of organic matter, of carbon to the atmosphere. This also has a temporal dynamic. And the point I want to make is that these temporal dynamics are not taken into account in the emissions factors. The emissions factors are static in time. And they also don't necessarily get taken into account because we don't necessarily have full coverage of these temporal dynamics in a particular site that's being studied. So what we've done is, and this is just also to show that the interpretation, particularly for subsidence, is open to interpretation. There are a number of models, some of which have been validated in sites and some of which are just taken from the literature and applied without any validation to the sites. And you can see using different models. So we have a number of studies down the table. We have the original results. Then we have the study. There was one study by John Cohenberg and Al Hoyer that actually looked at a bunch of sites and applied one particular model. There's the model that we applied and adopted in the IPCC. And I should say, John and Al were part of our team, so they agreed to the model that we applied here. But we get very different results site to site. And there's also a paper by Carlson that came up with very different models. And not only do the individual sites differ, but we come up with very different averages this way. So these are some of the difficulties we deal with as scientists trying to interpret the literature and generate emissions factors. These are just the emissions factors we came to. What we did was we put together estimates based upon the mass balance approach. We took estimates also based upon the substance approach, and then took the average of the two to generate these emissions factors. Took the average of the two for the site, for the types of land use where we actually had these two types of observations. And that was typically acacia plantations and oil palm plantations. For the rest of the sites, we had to use all mass balance. So this is just to give you an idea of the constraints that we're confronted with, but also the limitations of what a tier 1 factor is, why it's so much better to use tier 2 and even use tier 3 to try and capture these temporal and spatial dynamics that are not necessarily captured. But tier 1 is still used, it's useful for what they call non-key categories in IPCC parlance, which are insignificant portions of your inventory, or less than 5% of your total emissions, or less than 10% of your uncertainty in your emissions. So these are the conclusions. Not all peats are arbitrophic, so we don't have full representation of all the types of peats that are out there in the current emissions factors. Tier 1 factors are best estimates based upon available data, and we are victims of what is available and what's not available. And we always say the tropical ecosystems are underrepresented in the literature, and this is a good case where they are underrepresented. The geographic coverage for particular ecosystems is not necessarily representative. It's not a random sample. It's not a representative sample. It's a convenience sample. Some studies were designated to answer other questions, and we've had to adapt to those studies to what we needed. Temporal dynamics are not taken into account, and much more data is needed in the tropics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou, for your presentation. It's amazing to see that we know peatlands are there or have been there for many, many, many years, and still we need to unlock so much knowledge around them, especially now that how they evolve is something absolutely critical for climate change. So thank you for all of this research and contribution. Now we move to Dr. Jamsarena Suren, we call her. She's the Senior Program Officer for the Technical Support Unit of the Task Force for National Greenhouse Gas Inventories for IPCC. She has extensive experience on gas inventories, soil research, and other domains. So over to you, Suren.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to attend and present about IPCC emission factor database, EFTB, which is one of the supporting tools for estimation of the greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So EFTB was launched in 2002, and it is an open library of emission factors and other parameters with background documentation. It contains default data from IPCC guidelines and other data such as data from peer-reviewed scientific journal papers and other publications such as national reports, including national inventory reports. So FTB is also serves as a platform to share data and information that can be used for estimation of greenhouse gas emissions removals. So it is well recognized as a useful tool for national greenhouse gas inventories. FTB is also one of the important resources for development of IPCC guidelines. In developing IPCC guidelines, authors consider widest possible range of available literatures and data sources, including the AFTB. And so populating the AFTB with new data supports the process of refinement of IPCC defaults. We also have a non-IPCC default data in the AFTB, and then those data is a useful source for information for users in applying higher tier methods, as you mentioned, tier 2, tier 3 methods. So one of the important concepts of the AFTB is the responsibility of appropriate use of AFTB data will always remain with the users, and the users have to decide whether particular data in FTP is appropriate in their national circumstances and specific conditions, etc. So FTB is IPCC supporting material, so it is not subject to formal IPCC review process. Database evolves dynamically through data proposals, submissions from experts, researchers, and also data collection efforts. For example, we organize annually expert meeting to collect data for the FTB, and also we conduct literature search to identify potential data sources to prepare data proposals. FTB is open to any data proposals. All data proposals submitted to FTB are considered by the FTB editorial board for inclusion into the FTB. And in consideration of data proposals, editorial board checks robustness, applicability, and documentation of data. So we hold editorial board meeting annually to consider data proposals and discuss how to improve, enhance the FTB. The most recent meeting of editorial board held in June, July this year in Bilbao, Spain. This slide illustrates the process, how the FTB is populated. And regarding the expert meeting to collect data for the FTB, so-called data meetings, these meetings have been organized since 2008, focusing on specific sectors, categories, and attended by data providers, for example, inventory experts, researchers, and other experts, and editorial board members. So the most recent data meeting was held in parallel with the editorial board meeting in June, July in Spain. So this slide briefly explains the criteria for inclusion of new data in the FTB. Just here to note that consideration of data proposals by editorial board is not full scientific review of papers data. The aim is to collect data useful for national greenhouse gas inventories. FTB has two applications, web and offline applications. The offline application is available for download at our website. So FTB has several search functions, and the search results can be exported as an Excel file. We also have filter functions to narrow down search results, and the details of data can be, particular data can be seen by clicking a detail button here. So this is one of the example of export file of the search result, and each data in FTB has its own ID. And then this is another example of a detail of data This can be also exported as an Excel or Word file. So the last slide. So the FTB has been enhanced and improved. The regularly updated with new data. More than 600 data were accepted by the editorial board. The meetings held this year in June, July, and the user interface is continuously improved. And we will release new upgraded version of the database in 2023 next year. And finally, submission of data by inventory experts, researchers for inclusion into the FTB is critical to populating the FTB with the latest, robust, scientifically sound data and support continuous improvement of IPCC guidelines and national greenhouse gas inventories. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Suren, for I think, a very clear explanation of EFDB and how it operates and how it helps bring together all the massive amount of science and evidence coming from across the globe. There is a little bit of time for the audience to ask questions, probably not still on dairy, but more on measurement and on mitigation to Dr. Berchot or Suren. So if anybody wants to raise their hand, yes, we'll get you the microphone.
Hi, I'm Shafali Sharma, Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. So I just wanted to understand, you're saying that the Tier 1 emissions factors for peatlands is based on Southeast Asia's emissions factors? So yes. Does Ireland, for instance, use the Southeast Asia emissions factors, or what's happening now?
These emissions factors are for drainage of tropical wetlands. There is a separate emissions factor for drainage of temporal wetlands. Okay, and I should say that for the temperate zone, there's a lot of data from Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Scotland. The data is much more representative, much more broad-based, and there's a lot from Russia as well, and Canada. So it's much more representative. For the tropics, the only research that's been done is in Southeast Asia. So any emissions for drainage in tropical peatlands really is based upon data from Southeast Asia.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, as I don't see hands, let's then go back to Donald to manage the next session. And thanks to the panelists.
We don't need that. Well, am I on? Excellent. Thank you very much to CGIAR for that very useful session on some of the science that sits behind our challenges in terms of addressing climate change from agriculture. We're now going to switch gears a little bit, and as I introduced to you before, I'm Donald Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. And we want to talk to you today about some of the tools and techniques that we are developing in the dairy sector to help us understand the impacts of climate change from the global dairy sector. Now, in my opening before, I mentioned a little bit about the challenge that we've had over the last 10 years to track and monitor progress in the dairy sector. In addition to understanding climate change, as a global dairy sector, we've spent a lot of time researching the impact that dairy has on nutrition, on livelihoods, on economic growth, on women's empowerment. And as a dairy sector, we know all the good that we can do in the world. We know what we do from a nutrition perspective. We know what we do from a livelihoods, economic growth. But we have to acknowledge, as do all agricultural commodities, that we have an impact on the natural environment in which we operate. And our program within the dairy sector, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, is very much aimed at tackling those climate emissions from dairy. But as the old adage goes, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And so it is very important within the dairy sector to us that we have a clear understanding of the impacts that we have. So I'm delighted to be joined by two experts this morning. The first is Sanne Dekker. Sanne is a specialist with Royal Friesland Campina in the Netherlands. Sanne's work is all around life cycle analysis. She was also co-chair of the recent review of the International Dairy Federation's life cycle analysis methodology. And so, Sanne, I'd like to hand the floor to you. You have 6 or 7 minutes to share your thoughts.
All right, thank you, Donald. So if you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions from products, it's very important to look from cradle to grave at all greenhouse gases. Because if you're reducing one emission in one part of your production chain, it's always possible that you increase another one somewhere else in your production chain. So life cycle assessment or carbon footprinting really is the perfect method to do exactly that. It was invented in the 1970s, and since then, over 4,500 peer-reviewed studies on the carbon footprint of dairy have been published. That's really incredible. I cannot read them in my whole lifetime. So that gave us a really good view of the landscape of GHG emissions in the dairy production chain. It also showed us that footprints differ between geographies, between farming systems, and that there are also weather circumstances or political circumstances can affect that. We know exactly where the hotspots are in the production chains, and we also know how to reduce emissions, what are the mitigation options. So that is a lot of work that has been done. But now it's also important to start reducing emissions. So what we've seen is that improving productivity, especially in countries where that can be done, is really the best method to reduce the footprint of a product, the GHG emissions of a product. For example, by making sure that cows are healthy, have a long life, feed efficiency as well, you do precision fertilization, and you achieve good yields with it. Of course, a very important source of GHG emissions is the methane. Methane comes either from the cow's stomach or from the manure. And we have found that GHG emissions from enteric fermentation, they can be reduced up to 30%, for example, by optimizing the diet, by doing better breeding, or by applying feed additives. And we're doing that already in practice. A lot of them have been approved to be used in dairy farms by now. And emissions from the manure, they can be reduced up to 90%. For example, by making sure that the manure ends up outside during grazing, or by applying manure digestion. So there's a lot of good solutions in place. Also, grasslands are very important for climate adaptation. The roots go deep, they're good resilient against weather circumstances that are differing, but also they sequester carbon. They have high stocks of carbon, much higher than, for example, arable soils. So many of the dairy companies, they have set Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 targets. The top 10 dairy companies have all committed to science-based targets. Companies like Friesland Campina, Arla, Fonterra, they really find it important to achieve those targets, especially the Scope 3 targets, because a lot of emissions are coming from there, coming from the farms. So since 2015, we started implementing farm-specific footprinting. So we're monitoring on an annual basis the footprint of tens of thousands of farms, and we're rewarding them financially for doing better. We're also collaborating horizontally and vertically in the production chain. So we're doing pilots with feed producers, we're doing pilots with customers. We're also making have started on valorization of our carbon reductions with our customers. For example, by making business-to-business agreements and launching labels that are sourcing milk from farms that have a lower carbon footprint or that are reducing their carbon footprint. Comparison of footprints between companies, between studies, it's always very challenging. So that's why we also as a sector have to come together and agree how exactly we are calculating. And there's 3 important standards out there. So the one from IDF, which was launched in Delhi again last year, last September, which gives a quite condensed view of how at a global level to calculate your carbon footprint. It was made by over 50 scientists from 17 countries. I chaired the work. It was really just so nice to sit together with all the people from the different countries discussing the methods and agreeing on how to do this. And then there's the product environmental footprinting category rules from the European Commissions. They're very concise guidance, and they're supposed to be included in a legislative proposal that will come out probably by the end of this month, that will set rules for making commercial green claims. So if you want to make a claim in the market, you'll have to use this standard. And then, of course, there's the FAO LEAP guidelines, which are very, very condensed, very concise, very extensive standards for experts to calculate emissions from feed additives, from carbon sequestration, and from product environmental footprinting. So I hope that in this 6 minutes, I've made clear that we're really working very hard every day, collaboratively as a dairy sector to reduce the emissions. And I hope you're all joining us to do that even better in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sanna, for your intervention. Sanna mentioned a couple of really important topics, one being the way many developed countries, the dairy companies in those developed countries have committed to science-based targets, SBTI. And in SBTI, you measure your emissions in different scopes. And for those of us in the dairy sector, Scope 3 emissions are really a huge issue because that's where the emissions on farms sit. And many of those dairy companies that Sanna mentioned have set targets of a 30% reduction in their Scope 3 emissions by 2030, which is all in line with the Paris 1.5 agreement target. And we'll be talking more about that work on Friday at our official side event, and then later in the afternoon at 4:30 back here again. So thank you again, Sanna. Hold your questions to the end, and I do expect questions, so if you haven't got any questions, I'm going to start asking them of you. But our next speaker is Brian Lindsay. Brian is a consultant based out of the UK, but works very, very closely with the dairy sector, with Global Dairy Platform, where he represents us as our sector lead in sustainability. And Brian is also the lead of the Dairy Sustainability Framework. But we've asked Brian to talk on 2 topics today. One is on carbon sequestration in the dairy sector, and the other is on the linkage between improving animal care and greenhouse gas, which is the subject of a report that was just launched by FAO. So Brian, could I ask you to hold your microphone right up? Because there's some competition for us over the back here, but we need to shout them down.
Certainly, Donald, and thank you very much. Coming right back to where you started this meeting today, it's about you can't manage what you don't measure. So what I'm going to be talking a bit about today is not actually carbon sequestration and how we've solved the challenge, but more about how we quantify it. Quantifying our progress, our impact is so critical so we know whether we're working, whether we're failing, and we can design strategies to amend that. In 2018, or back to Sanna's comment actually about the International Dairy Federation Life Cycle Assessment Methodology, that was first launched in 2010. But the dairy sector has also been asking the scientists ever since 2010 when we launched that, when can we include sequestration? This is a challenge for us. How do we include it? Is the science there yet? Can we do it? Finally, in 2018, the scientists said, yep, let's give it a go. We think we know how we can incorporate sequestration into an LCA type approach when quantifying your carbon impact as the agricultural sector. So we embarked on this project, and this was a project that was funded by dairy and beef organisations. Donald, you also mentioned collaboration. Sana, you did also. Collaboration is absolutely critical in getting this common understanding and how we progress in these areas. So these organisations came together in 2018, and finally we launched a set of guidelines for calculating carbon sequestration using a life cycle assessment approach in September this year. 4 years of my life that I'll never get back, but 4 years of my life that was absolutely challenging but great at the same time. Watching people from our sector try and find not the lowest answer, not the easiest route, but the right route, the science-based route. So we had scientific advisors, we had organisations and consultants from all around the world working on this. And another thing we did also, we recognised there's others working in the sequestration space. There's a lot of people talking about sequestration and saying how it's the saviour, but a lot of people don't know how to calculate it. And that's why we embarked on this project. Many of the organisations who put money in this were cooperatives. Their farmers had lots of grassland, they had grazing animals. They thought they must be carbon neutral. Part of this is about educating our own sector as well, but we needed those numbers, a calculation methodology, to enable us to go back to our farmers, educate them, but also bring them on the journey with us on how we can now include sequestration in our calculations. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. We're always quantifying emissions. What about the sequestering bit? And how do we as companies and cooperatives drive the right behaviours in our farmers? What works in different geographies? What works in different climatic zones? The methodology we've developed and published has helped us get to that point where we can quantify and then have a dialogue about our progress. This methodology wasn't just built in a dark and smoke-filled room by the dairy industry and beef industry. It went through a public consultation where we got 45 pages worth of feedback, which we reacted to all of it. It has also been through a series of pilots. We did 50 pilots on dairy systems in 9 different geographies. And boy, it's all very well having a methodology, but then go and implement it. A whole new area of learning. But we're there. It's now available in the International Dairy Federation website, free of charge. We now need people to use this because the authors of this document, the dairy and beef organisations who are behind this, are very humble. They recognise this as a start. Science will evolve. And we recognise that if we didn't get out there and do this, it wouldn't get done. We've got to get our sector moving, so that's what we've done. So that's one piece of work the sectors have come together with, work collaboratively in order to move us all forward and talk the same language. The second piece of work Donald asked me to just mention today is about some work on livestock health and the relationship to emissions. The Dairy Sustainability Framework and Global Dairy Platform and Global Research Alliance did some work several years ago looking at improved livestock health and the impact on emissions as a result. And I can tell you, if we just take dairy cow fertility as an example, if we improve dairy cow fertility, we can actually reduce emissions intensity from anything from 7 up to 44% of emissions intensity, depending on where your starting point was. And that was just one of the conditions we looked at. We looked at 3 different conditions. This is available on the Dairy Sustainability Framework website. But that said, we've got to do something here because when you look at how we can manage emissions mitigation, it's about having a suite of options. There's no one option that suits everyone, and most farms will need a suite of operations to introduce to enable them to reduce their emissions. When we looked at this also, we looked at the cost of acting on those challenges. And we know that even though that for fertility, anything from $2 to $15 US per cow can achieve that outcome. So it's not a huge investment by the farmer either. So we've got these win-win opportunities about enabling farmers to act and actually make a difference in a quantified way, and the livestock benefit at the same time. So with that knowledge, we then took a project, the Global Research Alliance and ourselves, a global dairy platform, worked with the food and agricultural organisations funded by the New Zealand government, thanks for this, but we also involved the World Bank and IFAD, who are doing work in this space in some countries also. What we've done is taken this knowledge about understanding that livestock health can have a tremendous positive impact on mitigation, and we've written a publication that's available on the FAO website about how we can include improved livestock health in our nationally determined contributions, therefore showing livestock can be part of the solution, not just seen as the cause. This will this will require collaboration again. Industries and governments will need to work together, and as previous sector speakers have said, this needs to be at least a tier 2 methodology beyond to pick up any actions at farm level to be able to capture it in your reporting. So really positive piece of work here. It will require collaboration between industry and governments to make sure that we can actually see livestock as part of the solution and not the cause of climate change. Donald, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Brian. And we have some time for questions, but I have, to kick us all off, I have the first question for Brian. And that's, Brian, you've mentioned, and I mentioned as well, the Dairy Sustainability Framework. I note we have several governors from the Dairy Sustainability Framework in our audience today. Pier Cristiano, the president of the International Dairy Federation. Lovely to see you, Pier Cristiano. And also Krista Harden, the CEO and president of the US Dairy Export Council. Would you just take a moment, Brian, and talk about the role of the Dairy Sustainability Framework?
Yeah, Donald, developed by the dairy sector in recognising we have a challenge with sustainability, and we need to be recognised for what we're doing about sustainability. So the Dairy Sustainability Framework was developed by the dairy sector and launched in 2013 in Yokohama, and it covers all 3 pillars of sustainability, not just climate and the environment, but also the social and the economic pillars. And when you start to put them into pillars, you realise that you can't. The interrelationships between those pillars are fundamental, and the understanding of that is really important. You solve a challenge in one pillar, you might have an unintended consequence in the other. So we need this holistic view on how we approach sustainability as the dairy sector. What the Dairy Sustainability Framework is about is demonstrating the dairy sector is a responsible industry. It's monitoring and reporting over 30% of the global milk production, which represents actually over 51% of the world's formal milk production. And what we're doing is monitoring and reporting our continuous improvement on sustainability using 11 indicators in those 3 pillars. So each year we publish a report on data provided by our members on how we're progressing. So we've just released the 2021 calendar year report last week. So if you want to go on the DSF website, it'll be up there and you can see how we're progressing. But more importantly, this is about collaborating. It's about sharing information in a pre-competitive environment so all dairy sector moves forward, not just the developed or the developing. It's about all of us moving together forward.
Thank you, Brian. No, I think there's a couple of questions from the audience. If we can, there's one at the back and one in the middle, I think. So can we pass that microphone, please?
Hello, Pablo Freire from Argentina. Well, my question is partially answered by you, but it's not technical, it's political in my question. Your work contributing to reduce greenhouse emissions, I think that's silence work, no? How we can contribute to share information to consumers, to all the society, to youth, young people who are talking about livestock is bad. What we can do together? We work together in GAS, in the global agenda, in LIVE, but what more we can do to share more information you produce every time? Thank you.
Great question. I wish I had a dollar for every time somebody's asked that question, and I wish we had put all those dollars together to find the answer. We do have a challenge connecting with our stakeholders, and I think with agriculture we have a huge range of stakeholders as well, and part of our challenge is working out what are the messages that each one wants to hear. But one thing we do in the DSF is we provide all our data to our members. DSF isn't really a public-facing organisation, but our members are. They tend to be dairy cooperatives and other parts of the industry. They have communication specialists and they can work with those. But organisations like Global Dairy Platform have communications groups where they share ideas again about how do we package this information to ensure that the right stakeholders hear the right message. And I'm sure, Donald, you have some comments on that.
It is a great challenge, and one of the challenges that I think we all have in the livestock sector is that we are under threat, but often not based on science, and so it takes us time to produce the evidence, and in that time, of course, the negative narrative sometimes can grow. So it's something that we're working on in the dairy sector. We have a very active program between GDP and the International Dairy Federation where we meet every year and talk about how do we position the dairy sector and address some of those challenges. So thank you for that. Our next question, please.
Hi, I'm a farmer from the U.S., and I very much appreciate now that you can put numbers to measure metrics for these items, such as sequestration and greenhouse gases. But I'm curious about, we've got some countries that are putting caps on the amount of livestock that you can have in certain areas. And based on the data that you now have, is that going to be able to prove that you're moving that elsewhere and you're just moving those emissions, and we're not taking care of the situation at the place where it's originated? And then the second part of that is, how does that relate to the 3 pillars of the sustainability goals? How does that impact from your socioeconomic impacts in those locales and things like that, and just an overall picture from a food security position as well?
Fantastic. Do you want to start, Brian? Or I'll let Brian start and then I'll finish off, and then we'll hand back to Tanawat.
Great question, and great to have a producer in the room. Thank you. Very similar to Pablo's question in that, how do we make sure, it's no use collecting data if you're not going to use it. And our challenge is, how do we make sure we use the data we have? But what data does do is enables you to go with emotion, but also back it up with evidence. And a lot of the organisations I speak to say, thank you for bringing us some evidence, because we have a lot of people coming to us with emotion and no evidence. So at least you as the dairy sector are collaborating, trying to understand your position. You may not be perfect, and you won't be perfect in every area, but at least you know this and you're acting responsibly. So it is being used, but we need it to be used more. You're absolutely right. And that's why I say we make our data available to our members to go and work in their different respective areas. And we have what's called aggregating members. Sometimes whole countries are members of the DSF. Sometimes those dairy sectors had that data as individual companies, not as a national dairy industry. They can now have a really responsible dialogue with their governments about how they move forward, because they've got pooled data, and it enables them to have that dialogue.
And I think the second part of your question was really, how do we make sure we don't trade off one element of sustainability against another? And we're starting to see that at the moment with some countries where the government strategy seems to be to reduce herd size as their way to solve climate change. But that will simply push the problem elsewhere. People aren't going to stop consuming animal-sourced foods. It's simply going to move the problem elsewhere. And I think the role of organizations like FAO and the United Nations Environment Program, they really need to keep reminding countries and governments that we have to solve climate change and nutrition on a global level, not on a national basis. And I think really you hit the nail on the head. That's one of the key challenges we have. I think, Tanawat, we're a little out of time on our panel, and I do need to hand back to you, but my thanks again to our panelists today.
Thank you very much, all speakers and also colleagues. I think all of you know that working together, we can make difference. And that's why today's FAO, we send a clear signal to all our stakeholders that we want to work with CGIAR to make sure that we can bring science and innovation to support our producers, farmers, and also industries, and also private sectors. And that's why regarding the dairy sectors today, we need to bring all of your effort to make sure that we can build positive, global positive and balanced narrative of livestock sectors, of dairy sectors, and also to ensure that all the actions, all the talk that we talk here at COP27 or at elsewhere, all the policies, global policy, need to be translated into action at the country level. And that's why all the producers, farmers, and also all stakeholders who join us here today, we will continue to work at the country level and also to make sure that we can bring result. We can have impact more and more. And that's why FAOs, together with other international organizations, we are strongly support the work that you are doing right now for pathways to dairy net zero. And also FAO will continue to work with all of you to make sure that we will have many more pathways, not only for dairy, but also for other livestock sectors, poultry sectors, beef sectors, feed sectors, to make sure that we go for more sustainable, efficient, and also inclusive and resilient manners. And that's why we are discussing, you know that in September, when our colleagues from international dairy federations and other partners organized the World Dairy Summit in India, you can see that when we discuss in India, the Prime Minister of India came with a better futures for our farmers, for our people, better nutrition, better income for farmers, better development, socio-economic impact, and development for farmers. When we go to Africa, Africa also want more nutritional securities, food securities, and also better animal protein for better growth of their children, better income for their farmers. And that's why we need to make sure that we build global positive balanced narrative of livestock sectors, dairy sectors, and that's why we need CGIFA to support the work of FAO, to support the work of the livestock sectors and all stakeholders to make sure that we can build the evidence, we can show the evidence, and that's why during the years and next years, FAO together with all other sectors, we will show the global assessment, we will inform you the global positive narrative of the livestock sectors. We will give you more information and evidence of the global assessment, global report of livestock and nutrition, livestock and livelihood, livestock and employment, livestock and other issues, to make sure that when we talk about livestock sectors, we have a balanced narrative. We have a positive and balanced narrative. And you are the one can echo your voice. You are the ones who can communicate. You don't need to wait any others one to help you for communications. As a producers, as a farmers, as a private sectors, for dairy sectors, livestock sectors, you are the ones who can echo your voice. You are the ones who can communicate and inform the world that livestock is a part of solution. Livestock is a part of agri-food system. Livestock bring better solution for our planetary boundary. And you are the one who can make change. You are the one who can make difference. We need to work together. Thank you for joining us at FAO Pavilion today. And also the same issues on dairy sectors, the same issues on livestock sectors. We will continue to discuss the same times on Friday 11:30 at the main pavilions. When you enter to the COP, you will see us. And also we will continue here as well on Friday around 4:30 here at FAO Pavilions. And also we have another on Saturdays 12 at the Swedish pavilions. We will continue to make sure that we bring the positive and balanced narrative. We will continue to talk and make more action, make more result, and make more impact together. Thank you very much, and we'll see you during the week. Thank you. I would like to ask the speakers to join us the group photo here as well, and after that we will have a group photo with our audience to make sure that we really make our commitment to change. We make commitment to do things better together. I think someone can help us to take a photo, please. Our speaker, please, first, and then second round.